we are in Mood House once again, January 23rd today, 2019. Starting a new year, we get to do it again. We're in a new study, the Gospel of John. We're in week 2. And so I think rather than me commenting, why don't we just go ahead and read the text from last time. Would somebody read for us John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. Okay.
What we talked about last week was, in summary, number one, John begins his gospel by interpreting the creation account in light of his context. And he's looking back. He's looking at Genesis chapter 1 and his methodology, which was common at the time and later formally named Midrashic interpretation, and it means filling in the gaps. So this is my perspective. This is what my view is on interpreting this text, is that he is looking back using a methodology that was in place at the time, and that methodology where there were Jewish scholars, rabbinic scholars that would take the words of the Torah and they would interpret those, filling in the gaps. That's what midrashic means, midrash, filling in the gaps, and not reinterpret, but interpret those texts of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, within bringing those into the modern current culture, explaining what those texts mean. It's really no different than what we would call commentary, although there's a real emphasis in the fact of applying those to the current time. And that's the methodology that I think John is using within his gospel, is he's looking back and utilizing this interpretive method. It wasn't called Midrashic interpretation until probably the 2nd century AD, but the methodology was in place, and that's what I think. So number 2, John interprets Genesis chapter 1 as God existing as 2 equal powers in relation to each other, and they are also one. In other words, John is looking at Genesis chapter 1, and he uses the word, the Word. He's saying that there is an agency within the Godhead, this agency of communication and extension to all of creation, and he's naming that agency within the Godhead as the Word. And this idea of the Word is not something John just dreamed up. It was something that Old Testament scholars were dealing with for years in Judaism. There was much debate on what is the nature of the Godhead. Of course, Judaism is founded on the idea of monotheism, one God. We referenced the Shema last week out of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. But however, there is indication within the Old Testament that there are 2 powers in heaven. We'll look at Daniel chapter 7, Son of Man. We'll look at that in the days to come. And I cited the wisdom proverb, chapter 8, that wisdom was dwelling with God from the very beginning. And so there was questions in those times. No different than today. We're looking at the Godhead as Trinitarians, and there's a lot of questions about how is that existence within the Godhead, that relationship. So we're not going to go into all that detail, but at least here this idea of the Word. The Word is something that John now attributes to the Godhead, that there is a relationship. Number 3, John identifies one of these 2 powers as the Word and as the creative agency and sustainer of all that there is. Okay, so that's where we launched out last week, and I used this slide here where I showed kind of as we were moving through the first 4 verses that there is a oneness in the Godhead, and coming out from this oneness there is the Word, and within the Word there is life, and that life is the light of men. And we took a stab at defining what this relationship is what does light do? It gives us the ability to see and discern, and it gives us the ability to move about, and it gives us the ability to return home. That was just something I how I'm looking at it. And so out of this all things, this is new, all things here are created by the Word. And what I see, guys, is relationship within this, not only within the Godhead, but within all of the created order. There is this creative action of God, and God is not only creative and then watching, but He through the Word, the agency is brought into creation, and He is the source of all that there is, life. And that life gives us the ability to see and to move about and return home. So it's all coming out here in one large relationship, and that's how I see it. And I'm using the language from John as he's attaching the word to the Godhead. So we move on to verse 5. And verse 5, I don't have the numbers of the verses, but it's underlined. And verse 5 reads, "The light shines into the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." So Everett, thanks for speaking about light today. And so this is the next movement within the text. It's talking about light, which John has already attributed to the Word. And he's saying that now there is some sort of relationship going on he introduces the word darkness. And so we're going to look at what that is. And from the very get-go, we come to our first interpretive fork in the road. We have a decision to make. And as I've read sources, we can go in one of two directions. And it's not, and they both can be used contextually. And so I had to vote. Which way am I going? So in one sense, the word comprehend, the darkness, we're talking about the action of the darkness in response to the light. So how does the darkness respond to the light? And the word in the text is used comprehend, and that can be interpreted in one of two ways. One is understood, that the darkness could not understand the light. Could not. Whoa, that's interesting.
The light went out.
Yeah. Here, let me get back here. Wasn't that interesting? I mean, that was like on cue here. That was kind of cool. So understood. And let's try it again. Okay, so the darkness could not understand or grasp or receive the word. That there was this rejection, receiving. The darkness couldn't receive the word, couldn't receive the light. Or the darkness, there's a conflict set up between light and darkness, and the darkness could not overpower the light. Okay, they're both true. Okay? They're both true. So what is John looking at, and how is he interpreting it? So this is what my task is to try to figure that out. So this is my view of this, and I'm going to build it here. In the beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, we begin the story of all that there is in darkness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the earth. Then God steps in and says what? Let there be light. And there was light. And so here is how I see it, is that right there, the light bulb and the Word, okay, the Word is now moving across the face of the waters. And I'm trying to look at this how I think John is looking at Genesis chapter 1. The Word spoke. Now in Genesis it says God spoke. But John is attributing, he's identifying the agency within that relationship of the Godhead, and he's identifying it as the Word. The Word spoke. And the Word, at the very beginning, drove out the darkness and creating the possibility, and I'm using the word to comprehend, to see. It's like if you and I were walking down a dark stairway into a basement that had no lights. It is total darkness. And God spoke, and it's like you turn on the light, and when you turn on the light, you're now able to comprehend all of the items within that basement and their positioning to each other, what they are. You see boxes, and you see an old you can see boxes and stuff that's been there for years, and trunks, and you see maybe a rocking horse and a baby crib and stuff that has been in the basement, but the light allows you to now comprehend of the forms and the objects within that basement. So in this case, the darkness didn't overpower the light overpowered the darkness. Okay? So, let me move on. The Word then brought all things together. Again, I'm using the language of John. The Word then brought these entities together. And that's what the story in Genesis chapter 1 is all about. It's a very succinct and very organized order, as God is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. And so now, and then the commentary within the text in Genesis is all was good. Then he moves to the sixth day, when the Word created the man and the woman to be in relation with each other and himself. They're walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And again, I'm attaching the word to the entity that is there in relationship with the man and the woman. And there's relationship within the garden, and the text itself says, now all was very good. Okay, you guys know that. So then what happened, and now we're in Genesis 3, and I'm again stating to you that I think John, this is what's in John's mind as he's starting his gospel. A second voice entered the world, offering a counter proposal to what we see in Genesis 1 and 2. And the intent of this proposal by this other voice was to separate the relationship of the man and the woman with the Word. Did God say? Remember? They're putting, like driving a wedge, making the suggestion that God is not trustworthy. And so that suggestion was there. And you know the story. The man and the woman embraced the counter-proposal. They believed the second voice. And in so doing, their eyes were opened, just as the Word had spoken, resulting in the inner drive. This is the result, when they clothe themselves. This is important. Resulting in the inner drive, something within inside them caused them to want to cover up. And thus, separation, the idea, the concept, the reality of separation entered the world. Up till now, it was oneness. It was relationship. But separation entered the world, and that is what the Bible calls death. Death is what, remember, the word God said, in the day you eat of it, you will die. And the very act then drove them to separate. And then of course we see in the text God reaching out in an amazing way. Yes, Carl?
I don't mean to interrupt, but
But you're not going to interrupt.
I'm taking notes on what you're doing here this morning, and the word popped up, counterattack. And the counterattack popping in right here at this point.
A counterattack
Yeah.
from the enemy, from the serpent?
Yeah.
Another word for separation.
Yeah.
Separation.
Yeah.
That you're talking of here.
Yeah.
Separation. And
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
And we're going to kind of dwell on this idea. This is, again, from my mind and my heart to you. This is how I interpret. This is how I interpret the opening chapters of Genesis. Is the problem is separation, and the Bible calls it death. Yes.
I would call it the return of darkness, because if the Word is the source of light, and temptation was you can be your own God, you don't need the light, you can be your own light, which wasn't true. Once they cut themselves off from God, they re-entered darkness.
Oh, Bill, gee, you looked ahead. Okay, look at there, Bill. By golly, Bill, what would we do without Bill? You know?
I get a gold star?
And I'm sorry you can't read this. I need to have a more powerful projector. But thank you, Bill. That is exactly my point. Is that the darkness returned once again. Now there was darkness. Now, having said, we're kidding you, Bill, but in my opinion, as I look at these opening verses in John chapter 1, it is the second darkness that John is referring to in his midrashic interpretation of Genesis. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not comprehend it, or I'm taking the view, grasp it. The darkness couldn't get it. The darkness couldn't receive it. And it's like in John's, as he's telling the story, retelling the story of creation, filling in the gaps, using the midrashic in style, he's saying the plot thickens. Okay? That's how I want you to see this. The plot thickens. And so in the beginning, now here's the flow of the text so far as I see it. He's telling a story under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And under the inspiration, he's saying, okay, movement one within this flow. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. There is oneness relationship. Movement number two in the text. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So this word now comes out from the oneness, although it never separates. And he is the creative, this word is the creative agency and also the sustainer of all things. That's movement 2. And then movement 3 is the plot thickens, the light shines into the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Okay, do you see that? All this is great, but what movement 3 then shows within the art of storytelling is that there's got to be a problem, a setup, something, a conflict that needs to be resolved. So this is the conflict. In my view, John is now setting up the conflict of the story that's going to be resolved. I mean, you guys know the end, or at least part of the end. That he's setting up the story that now will be fulfilled through, and the Word became flesh. But we're not there yet in verse 14. Okay, so it's a quarter after, and I purposely went through pretty fast because I'd like for you to at your tables to talk about this idea of darkness and separation. And we've added these two key terms. Last week we started out with oneness, one, and we looked at the Word as part of this oneness. And within the Word there is life and light. And And now we've introduced this new idea of the conflict of the story. And the conflict of the story is this idea of darkness and the relationship of the darkness to the light. And in that darkness, the first darkness of creation, the light came in and drove out the darkness. But then there's the story in Genesis 3 where separation took place because of the man and the woman, and they believed the other voice. And as a result, that separation, that hiding, and therein, as Bill told us, that's the second darkness here. The second darkness. And that sets the scene for what comes next that we'll look at next week. But what I'd like you to do now is let's talk about darkness. At your tables, discuss what you think is the relationship of these two terms. And can you think of an example? Just grapple with these ideas of light, darkness, and separation, and from your own experiences. We've got story after story. So let's do that, and I'll join the group as too. So, all right, I'll leave this on.